All right, so are you ready to dive into speaking English confidently? Like, really confidently?
I'm ready.
Okay, awesome. Because we've got a ton of cool stuff to unpack today, coming from real people who have been there. Like, we're talking tips and stories from people who have actually gone through the process of learning English and becoming fluent.
Yeah, and even stories about some famous people, too.
Oh, yeah. Like, there's this one story about a certain action hero. Um, I'm not going to spoil it now, but let's just say he had a pretty thick accent when he first came to Hollywood.
And let's just say it worked out pretty well for him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this deep dive is for anyone who wants to speak English more fluently, whether you're just starting out or you've been learning for a while and feel like you've hit a plateau. Actually, one of the things that I found super interesting is how much people were talking about podcasts as a learning tool.
Yeah. It makes sense, right? You're just surrounded by the language, just
Yeah.
like constantly.
You get to hear different accents, different speaking styles, and it's all real natural English.
Exactly. And one of the things that they talked about was the American accent and how it's like everywhere.
It's true. You hear it in movies, TV shows, music, you name it.
But I think it's also important to remember that there are other accents out there too, like British English is still really important in certain parts of the world.
Oh, absolutely. And it's great to be exposed to different accents. It just makes you a more well-rounded English speaker.
Totally.
Okay, so one of the people we hear from in this material is this really interesting English teacher. And what's really cool about them is that they're actually a native English speaker who grew up learning Spanish.
Wow. That's pretty unique.
Right. And then they went on to teach English to people from all over the world.
So they have a pretty incredible perspective on language learning.
Yeah, they totally get what it's like to be on both sides of the equation. Okay, so speaking of incredible perspectives, remember that action hero I mentioned earlier?
Oh, yeah. The one with the accent.
Yes. Well, get this. It's Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize he had such a thick accent when he first came to America.
Right. But he was determined to make it in Hollywood. So he knew he had to master English.
I bet that wasn't easy.
Oh, definitely not. But he didn't let that stop him. He enrolled in English classes, and he really made an effort to immerse himself in the language.
Like, how did he do that?
Well, he actually had this rule where he would only date American girls.
Really? Just so he could practice his English?
Yep. Talk about dedication.
That's pretty amazing.
It is. And, one of the things that all of these people talked about is that feeling of hitting a plateau in your language learning. Like, you're putting in the work, but you're just not seeing the progress you want.
Yeah, I think everyone experiences that at some point. It can be really frustrating.
Absolutely.
But it's important to remember that it's totally normal and that there are things you can do to get past it.
Okay, so tell me more about that.
Well, for starters, it's important to just keep practicing and not give up. And it's also really helpful to find ways to make learning fun and engaging.
Yeah, like finding things that you're actually interested in and using those to learn English.
Exactly, because when you're enjoying yourself, you're more likely to stick with it.
Totally.
And, sometimes it's helpful to switch things up a bit. Like, if you've been doing the same thing over and over again, maybe try a different approach.
Ooh, that's a good point.
Yeah, like if you've been focusing a lot on grammar, maybe try spending some time on pronunciation or vocabulary.
Or maybe try having more conversations with native speakers.
Exactly.
So let's dig into some of the specific tips and strategies that our language gurus recommended.
Awesome. I'm ready to take notes.
Me too.
Yeah.
So the first thing they emphasized was building a strong vocabulary. But they had a really interesting take on this.
Oh, like what?
They said that it's important to have a good vocabulary, but you shouldn't let the pursuit of perfect grammar hold you back from speaking.
That's so true. Sometimes I get so caught up in trying to get the grammar perfect that I forget to just speak.
Right. And they said that as long as you can get your point across, you're doing great.
I love that. It takes the pressure off.
Totally.
So it sounds like they're saying it's more important to just focus on communicating your ideas clearly.
Exactly. And the grammar will come with time and practice.
That makes sense.
They also talked a lot about overcoming fear and anxiety when speaking English.
Oh, that's a big one. I think everyone gets nervous when they have to speak a foreign language.
Oh, absolutely.
So what did they suggest for dealing with that?
Well, they said that it's really helpful to shift your focus away from yourself and onto the message you're trying to convey.
So instead of worrying about making mistakes or sounding stupid, just focus on getting your point across.
Exactly. And they said that the more you practice, the less nervous you'll feel.
That makes sense. Like anything else, it gets easier with practice.
Right. And they also had some great tips for finding opportunities to practice. Like finding a language partner, joining an English conversation group, or even just talking to yourself in the mirror.
Hey, whatever works.
Exactly. The key is to just find ways to use the language as much as possible.
And they also talked about the importance of immersing yourself in the language.
Yeah, like surrounding yourself with English as much as possible.
Right, like watching movies and TV shows in English, listening to English music, reading English books and articles, and even just changing the language on your phone and computer to English.
It's all about creating an environment where you're constantly exposed to the language.
And they had this really interesting tip about thinking in English.
Wait, what? Like literally thinking your thoughts in English?
Yep.
Wow, I never thought of that.
Me neither. But they said it's a really powerful way to improve your fluency. Because when you can think in English, you don't have to translate everything in your head first.
That makes so much sense.
Right. So it allows you to speak more naturally and spontaneously.
I'm definitely going to try that.
Me too.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today, but I want to make sure we hit on one last key takeaway from our language experts.
Okay, what is it?
They said that one of the most important things for speaking English fluently is to develop a habit of using the language regularly.
That makes sense. Like anything else, the more you do it, the better you get at it.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be anything big or fancy. Just find small ways to incorporate English into your daily life.
Like even just talking to yourself in English for a few minutes each day can make a big difference.
Totally.
Or you could try reading an English article or watching an English news segment every morning.
The key is to just make it a habit.
And the more you do it, the more natural it will become.
Absolutely. And before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on one more thing that our language enthusiasts brought up.
Okay, what's that?
They talked about the importance of mindset, like believing in yourself and your ability to learn English.
Oh, yeah, that's so important. If you don't believe you can do it, you're probably not going to.
Right. So it's really important to cultivate a positive and can-do attitude.
And to be patient with yourself. Learning a language takes time and effort.
Totally. And don't be afraid to make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes when they're learning something new.
In fact, mistakes are a sign that you're learning and growing.
So embrace them.
I love that.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive, but I'm excited to continue the conversation and explore even more strategies for speaking English confidently in our next installment.
Yeah, this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. So stay tuned for more insights and inspiration in our next episode.
And it's like building a house, right? You need that strong foundation before you can start adding on the walls and the roof.
That's such a good way to put it.
Yeah.
So, what are some of the other tools they recommended?
Well, they really emphasize that idea of not getting too hung up on perfect grammar, especially at the beginning.
Oh, yeah, don't let grammar be this big, scary monster that stops you from actually speaking.
Exactly. They were all about just getting your ideas out there, even if it's not perfectly grammatically correct at first.
It's more important to just communicate, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they believe that the grammar stuff will sort of fall into place naturally as you practice more and more.
It's like learning any new skill, right?
Mm-hmm.
You start out perfect. You got to allow yourself to make mistakes.
Exactly. And speaking of making mistakes, they talked a lot about overcoming that fear of speaking. That feeling of like your heart racing, your palms sweating.
Oh my gosh, yeah, that feeling of I don't want to say anything wrong.
Totally. And they had some really interesting advice for dealing with that.
Okay, like what?
Well, they basically said that you got to shift your focus, instead of focusing on yourself and how you sound, focus on the message you're trying to get across.
So it's not about me, it's about the message.
Exactly. Don't worry so much about making mistakes or sounding silly. Just worry about communicating your ideas clearly.
That's a really good way to think about it.
And of course, they emphasized practice, practice, practice.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's got to be key, right?
Oh, absolutely. They suggested finding a language partner, joining an English conversation group.
Ooh, those are good ideas.
Or even just talking to yourself in the mirror.
Hey, whatever works.
Right. The point is to just get those words out there and build that fluency muscle.
So it's all about creating those opportunities to speak, even if it feels a little silly sometimes.
Totally. And they also talked about the importance of immersion.
Like surrounding yourself with English as much as possible.
Exactly. Watching movies, listening to music, reading books.
Okay, yeah, those make sense.
Even changing the language on your phone or your computer to English.
It's about making English part of your daily life, not just something you study.
Exactly. And here's an interesting one. They talked about the importance of actually thinking in English.
Whoa, wait, what? Like literally thinking your thoughts in English.
Yep.
That sounds hard.
It can be challenging, but they say it's really powerful because it helps you to internalize the language, like you're not translating everything in your head anymore.
So you can just speak more naturally and fluently.
Exactly.
That's such a cool concept. I've never thought about it that way before.
Yeah, it's like rewiring your brain to think in English.
So how do you even do that? Like, how do you actually start thinking in English?
Well, they say it's all about surrounding yourself with the language as much as possible.
Okay, so like those immersion things we were talking about.
Yep. Like, the more you hear and see and read English, the more natural it will become for you to think in English.
Yeah, it's like you're training your brain to switch over to English mode.
Exactly. And over time, it'll become more and more automatic.
Wow, that's amazing. So thinking in English, immersing yourself in the language, not letting grammar fears hold you back. It's like all these pieces fit together to create this like fluency puzzle.
It is, isn't it? And it's so inspiring to hear these stories from people who've actually done it. Like
Yeah.
people who started out with no English and are now fluent speakers.
It shows that it's totally possible, right?
Absolutely. No matter what your background is or how long you've been learning, you can achieve fluency if you're willing to put in the work.
I love that message of hope. And speaking of hope, I think it's really important to remember that progress isn't always linear.
Oh, yeah, there are definitely going to be ups and downs along the way.
Totally. Some days you'll feel like you're making amazing progress, and other days you'll feel like you're back at square one.
It's like a roller coaster ride, right?
Exactly. But the important thing is to just keep going.
Yeah, and to celebrate those small wins along the way.
Oh, absolutely. Like even just learning one new word or having one successful conversation in English is a reason to celebrate.
Totally. And those small wins will eventually add up to big results.
So true. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. We've talked about a lot of external strategies for improving your English speaking skills.
Right, like finding language partners and immersing yourself in the language.
But what about the internal environment you've created for your language learning?
Ooh, that's a good one. Like, what's going on inside your head?
Exactly. Is it a place of encouragement and support? Or is it filled with self-doubt and criticism?
Because that inner voice can really make or break your language learning journey.
Totally. So I encourage you to take some time to reflect on your mindset and see if there are any changes you can make to create a more positive and supportive learning environment for yourself.
Like, maybe you need to start practicing some self-compassion and reminding yourself that it's okay to make mistakes.
Or maybe you need to surround yourself with positive people who believe in your ability to learn English.
Whatever it is, find ways to nurture that inner voice that tells you you can do it.
Because you absolutely can. And remember, fluency isn't a destination. It's a journey. So enjoy the ride and celebrate every step along the way.
And don't forget to have fun with it. Learning English should be an enjoyable experience, not a chore.
So true. All right, that's it for this deep dive into the world of speaking English confidently. We hope you found it insightful and inspiring.
And we hope you'll join us again next time for another fascinating exploration of language and learning.
Until then, happy language learning.